Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're on page 37 of your student journals, and our objective or our goal for the day is today I will compare fractions using common denominators. Okay, so let's kind of remind ourselves of something before we get started. We had talked about that multiplication property of 1 earlier. It says the product of any number multiplied by 1 is that number. This property is also known as the multiplicative identity property. And that's because when you multiply something by 1, it doesn't change its identity. So remember we talked about a fraction is equal to 1 if the numerator and denominator are the same. So all of these fractions would be equal to 1. 6 over 6, 2 over 2, 5 over 5, 12 over 12. Oops, I shouldn't have put a comma there, sorry. 100 over 100. Those are all equal to 1. So I can multiply any fraction by any of these, and I don't change its value or identity. Okay, so our steps today are really long when we read them. So I'm going to read them to you, but then I want you just to follow along with how I do them. So we're going to write the first fraction being compared, and we're going to multiply it by 1 using the denominator of the second fraction. So that's the key, is we're going to be multiplying by 1 using the denominators of the other fraction. Then we're going to write the second fraction being compared and multiply by 1 using the denominator of the first fraction being compared. So pretty much in both these steps, we're going to multiply by 1 and we're using the denominators of the other fractions. Then it says we're going to replace original fraction being compared with the equivalent common denominator fractions and compare. So our steps, again, I think seem confusing, but when you watch them, I think they'll won't be as hard. So I'm going to put this aside, and here's my first problem with my red pen. So it first says I'm going to write the first fraction being compared. So I'm going to write 4/6 down here, and I am going to multiply 4/6 by a fraction that's equal to 1. But I'm going to use this denominator to help me. So I'm going to multiply 4/6 by 2 over 2. And that's allowed because this is the multiplicative property of 1 where I'm not changing its identity. So 4/6 times 2 over 2 gives me 8/12. So 4/6 and 8/12 are equal. That's an equivalent fraction. Now, I'm going to do the same to the second fraction. I'm going to do 1/2, but now I'm going to look at the other denominator to help me. So I'm going to use now 6 over 6 for 1/2. So I use the denominator from the other fraction to help me. And I get 1 times 6 is 6, 2 times 6 is 12. So 1/2 and 6/12 are equivalent fractions. But look what happened when I did that. When I used the opposite denominators, I ended up with common denominators, with the same. Now when you have the same denominators, it's much easier to compare. So 4/6 is equal to 8/12, so I can write that down here. And 1/2 is equal to 6/12. Now when I just look at these as they are written, it's kind of hard to know which one is greater or less than because the denominators are different. And I didn't want to have to draw models, but now that they have the same denominator, it's really easy. So if 2 cakes were both cut into 12 slices, but this cake has 8 slices left and this only has 6, which one has more? So when they have the same denominator, that means that they're the same value. So it's really easy to say that 8/12 is larger. Okay, so let me show you another one of those. So I'm going to look at my first fraction, and I'm going to multiply it by 1 using the opposite fraction's denominator. So I get 15 over 45. Then I'm going to use the next fraction and multiply it by 1 using the opposite denominator. So I get 36 over 45. So 3/9 is the same as 15/45, and 4/5 is the same as 36/45. So since they both were cut into 45 slices, obviously this one's more because there's 36 slices left. So I'm going to grab that one. And then I can just put the same answer here because they're equivalent or equal. Okay, so let's try some of these together. So we are on page 38 of your student journal. And our first problem says 6/7 times 2/3. So we're going to write our first fraction, and we're going to multiply it by 1 using the opposite denominator, which would be a 3. So we get 6 times 3 is 18, and 7 times 3 is 21. Okay, then we're going to do our next fraction and multiply it by 1 using the opposite denominator, which would be 7/7. And we get 14 over 21. So 6/7 is the same as 18 over 21, and 2/3 is the same as 14 over 21. So because those are equal and those are equal, I know that 18 over 21 is more than 14 over 21, so 6/7 is more than 2/3. So we will put the greater than sign there. Okay, our next problem says 2/4 times 4/8. So I'm going to take my first fraction. I'm going to take my first fraction, and I'm going to multiply it by the opposite fraction's denominator, 8/8. And I'm going to get 16 over 32. And then my second fraction is 4/8. And I'm going to multiply it by the opposite denominator of 4/4. And I get 16 over 32. So because they are both 16 over 32, that means that those two fractions are equal. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, you have the next 3 pages to do on your own, and you may have a nice afternoon.